Hello. Today we'll be discussing the Scottsboro case from 1931. Before I get started with the discussion, I just want to warn you that there is some disturbing subject matter in the discussion, so keep that in mind. The Scottsboro case is probably the biggest miscarriage of justice that we'll learn about in this class. It is also probably the most egregious example of systemic racism in the United States criminal justice system that this country has ever seen. That said, the Scottsboro case is very complex and convoluted. There's a lot of moving parts to it. Um, so it's difficult to boil down to a simple discussion format like this. So rather than discuss the case piece by piece, I'm just going to hit on some of the highlights. In order to really understand the Scottsboro case, we have to keep in mind the context. We have to understand the time that it took place and also the location that it took place. So the case took place in Scottsboro, Alabama, which is basically the Deep South, in 1931 or the early 1930s. At that point in time, racist attitudes, prejudicial attitudes, and behaviors, and racism, unfortunately, were commonplace and were considered just a normal part of society. Racial tensions at that point in time were at an all time high, especially in the Deep South. Where this was, and in the early 1930s. So you have to keep that in mind when assessing what really happened at Scottsboro. So the case began in Stevenson, Alabama. A train was traveling through the state of Alabama bound for Tennessee, and it stopped in Stevenson. A group of about a dozen white men got off the train and went to the local sheriff's office and complained that they had been attacked by a group of African American men on the train. So the sheriff decided to form a posse to intercept the train, and the orders were to arrest anyone on board. So the posse intercepted the train when it stopped at its next scheduled stop in Paint Rock, Alabama, and everyone on board the train was pulled off and arrested and taken into custody. So among those arrested were 9 young African American men. Um, their names were Charlie Weems, Clarence Norris, Haywood Patterson, Andrew Wright, Willie Roberson, Ozzie Powell, Eugene Williams, Olin Montgomery, and Leroy Wright. They ranged in age from early teens to early 20s. They were all unemployed, and most of them were illiterate. And they would become known in the press um, and by the public as the Scottsboro Boys. Also on the train were Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, 2 young white women, and a young white gentleman named Orville Gilley. Victoria Price and Ruby Bates proceeded to tell the sheriff's posse that they had been raped by the 9 young African American men that were on board the train. And it was this allegation that started a series of trials, death sentences, and ultimately appeals to the State Court of Alabama and 2 appeals to the United States Supreme Court and 2 landmark Supreme Court decisions. In addition to this, we also saw a number of people come out of the woodwork, both to prosecute and persecute the Scottsboro defendants, and also to defend them. And this is a theme that we'll see again whenever we discuss famous cases, that there are people that come forward, and oftentimes their motives are questionable, and they come forward and insert themselves into these famous cases either to advance their own careers or to further some agenda that they have or to further their own ends. And so in the Scottsboro case, we saw a little bit of both. We had some prosecutors that attached themselves to the case early on because they wanted to advance politically. And we also saw some groups attach themselves to the case to defend the Scottsboro Boys, but ultimately they just wanted to further their agenda. Perhaps the Most prominent in this regard was the Communist Party. So the Communist Party stepped forward and offered to defend the Scottsboro boys during some of the appellate phases of the case. But they really didn't have an interest in whether the Scottsboro boys were guilty or innocent. They really just wanted to further their own ends and use it as an opportunity to spread communist propaganda. And this ended up hurting the Scottsboro boys in the long run because not only did they have all these factors working against them because of who they were, but they also had communist representation, and people in the Deep South and also in the United States at large did not appreciate that. Perhaps one of the greatest tragedies in this case, which is just marred with tragedy, is the fact that the Scottsboro boys were probably innocent. One of the victims in this case, Ruby Bates, she ended up recanting her story. And the medical evidence that was admitted during the trials was not suggestive of rape. The medical evidence did not support the stories that the victims told of being violently attacked. And so the evidence actually pointed to acquittal, but yet the Scottsboro boys ultimately were convicted in this series of trials despite the evidence of their innocence. So the case actually went to the Supreme Court twice, and I just want to touch on these cases briefly. The first time the case went to the Supreme Court was the case of Powell v. Alabama. And the question here was, did the Scottsboro defendants have adequate legal counsel? So the Scottsboro boys, all of them were unemployed and they were poor, and so they couldn't afford an attorney. And at that point, if you couldn't afford an attorney, basically you just had to rely on whoever came forward to offer their services. And so there were two elderly attorneys that did come forward and offer a defense for the Scottsboro boys during their first series of trials. One of these attorneys, however, was an alcoholic, and he was frequently intoxicated during the proceedings and slept through some of the proceedings. The other attorney was not admitted to the bar in Alabama and was actually unfamiliar with the rules of procedure in Alabama. And so it was questionable that they had adequate counsel. When this was initially appealed to the state of Alabama, the state argued that they were adequately represented and that the trials were fair. It was then appealed again to the United States Supreme Court, and this was the case of Powell v. Alabama, and the Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of the Scottsboro defendants and said no, there was no way that they had adequate counsel. They were not adequately represented by these two men. And so it was sent back for retrial. The second time the case went to the Supreme Court was in the case of Norris v. Alabama. And here the question was, did the Scottsboro defendants have a jury of their peers? So we are guaranteed a right to a fair trial by a jury of our peers, but the juries in all of the Scottsboro cases were white. And so the question was, how fair was this, considering that the Scottsboro defendants were all African Americans? And so the state of Alabama actually said that no, they did have a fair jury, and that there were no problems with the jury selection process in Alabama. That the jury selection process was fair, and that it just was a matter of circumstance that African Americans were not in the jury pool, or that they were not on these juries. The case then went to the Supreme Court, and evidence was presented that the state of Alabama had actually tampered with the jury records to show that African Americans had served on other juries in Morgan County, Alabama. And so once this evidence was presented, the United States Supreme Court obviously sent the case back for retrial and ruled in favor of the Scottsboro defendants. So fortunately, this corrective action was taken, but this should give you an example of just how bad this racism was within the system, to where we actually had the state court falsifying records to show that African Americans had served on juries in the past and that they had not been excluded from jury service. And fortunately, the Supreme Court took this corrective action. Despite the case going to the Supreme Court, ultimately many of the Scottsboro defendants were convicted. Fortunately, none of them were sentenced to death, but many of them were sentenced to prison. And most of them ended up serving their prison sentences and before they were eventually released. Some of them were released early, and some of them were actually pardoned by the state during their lifetime. But still, the case very much ruined their lives. Many of the Scottsboro defendants, when they were eventually released from prison, turned to alcohol or drugs or other criminal activity and ended up back in the system. And many of them never saw their names cleared. It wasn't actually until 2013 that the state of Alabama posthumously pardoned the remaining Scottsboro defendants who hadn't had their names cleared, but at that point, they were all dead. So in their lifetimes, many of them did not get to see the state admit to their wrongdoings in these cases. So anyway, the Scottsboro case, obviously a very important case, an egregious miscarriage of justice. We had two landmark Supreme Court decisions come out of it, specifically in the case of Powell v. Alabama, which dealt with the right to legal counsel, and Norris v. Alabama, which dealt with the right to having a jury of our peers. Okay, so that pretty much wraps it up for the Scottsboro discussion. If you have any questions about the case, please feel free to send me an email and I would be happy to address them.